Today marks the third stop on FCC Commissioner Anna Gomez's First Amendment listening tour. We're pleased that she chose East Kentucky and these coalfields as a place to have this talk. I'm Dee Davis, President of the Center for Rural Strategies in Whitesburg. Anna Gomez was sworn in as Commissioner of the Federal Communication Commission in 2023, and that was after serving in leadership roles throughout the FCC and before that in the National Telecommunications and Information Administration. At NTIA, she oversaw the nation's transition to digital television. Some of you will probably remember when Netflix came in an envelope every month. Though Commissioner Gomez was born in Florida and spent much of her childhood in Columbia, she now resides in the Commonwealth of Virginia. And it was occurring to me as we were looking at this that there are we have visitors here or guests here from Virginia, West Virginia, Kentucky, but at the moment that the First Amendment was written and put in the Constitution, we were all Virginia. This was all Virginia. In a way, this is welcome home to you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for having me. I was told I would get a much better reception if I said, "Go Cats." So, as you mentioned, I'm Anna Gomez, and I am the only sitting Democratic commissioner at the FCC, and one of the few remaining voices of a political minority at independent federal agencies. I must admit that our current political moment poses challenges unlike anything I had thought I would face as a FCC commissioner. This administration has been on a campaign to censor and control since before day one. And since day one, the FCC has been implementing the will of this administration and undermining the First Amendment at every turn. That's why I launched this First Amendment tour focused on pushing back against this administration's campaign of censorship and control. I felt the need to start taking our message in defense of our fundamental First Amendment rights and freedoms outside of Washington because I've been alarmed by the recent actions of this administration. Here's what concerns me. The First Amendment has protected our fundamental right to speak freely and to hold power to account since 1791. It is foundational to our democracy, and yet today the greatest threat to our freedom is coming from our own government. Silencing dissenting voices is not a sign of strength. It is a sign of weakness.
It comes from a place of fear that opposing views, rather than presidential decrees, will win out in the public debate of ideas. In recent months, the FCC has targeted the editorial decisions of news networks, independent reporting by public media, and internal labor practices by private companies. These are dangerous and unprecedented actions by an independent government regulator. More broadly, actions across the federal government have demonstrated a disturbing pattern of silencing dissenting voices. Here are just some of the most egregious examples. They have initiated investigations and floated debilitating regulation schemes that target national network broadcasters for their newsrooms' editorial decisions, harassed private companies for their diversity, equity, and inclusion practices, and threatened tech companies that respond to consumer demands for fact-checking. Separately, they've attempted to shutter the voice of America and sought retribution against lawful residents that protest administration policies. They are banning books and seeking to erase history from the public record and from our national museums. And they are targeting law firms, unions, and all those that have the skills and the will to stand up for the victims of this campaign of censorship and control. And of course, I cannot leave out the fact that they have been firing presidentially appointed, Senate-confirmed commissioners of multi-member agencies. The administration seems intent on targeting anyone who dares to speak up and disagree with its extreme agenda. Unfortunately, the administration's efforts to censor and control appear to be working. Some media outlets are finding it easier to retreat in the face of government threats than to be responsive to their audiences. Bill Owens, the executive producer of 60 Minutes, resigned because he no longer felt he had the independence that honest journalism requires. Similarly, another member of the press, the president of CBS News, Wendy McMahon, was forced to resign. She did so because their parent company, Paramount, is continuing to exert pressure on CBS News and their independent news reporting to satisfy the ideological demands of the FCC and this administration, all in a desperate attempt to win regulatory approval for their pending transaction. This is deeply concerning. We need journalists who feel free to report the truth even when it cuts against our own political biases. And corporate parents should give journalists the independence they need. A free press requires free journalists. And finally, I want to talk about why it's so important to protect the independence of independent agencies. The FCC is supposed to make decisions based on law, facts, and technical expertise, not politics. We take our direction from the Constitution, from the law, and from the public. That is what Congress intended. While FCC commissioners have had policy disagreements across the agency's history, by and large, we've understood the responsibility of ensuring that those on the outside look to us as a stable, independent, expert-driven body. Problematically, as we've seen at other independent agencies, such as the Federal Trade Commission, the Consumer Product Safety Commission, and the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, today, when commissioners of a political minority dissent, they are fired. It is vividly illustrative that even when this administration holds so much power, it cannot tolerate disagreement or dissent. I've said this before, but I'm going to keep saying it. If I'm removed from my seat at the commission, it wasn't because I failed to do my job, it's because I insisted on doing it. As a commissioner, it is my responsibility to respond to these attacks on the First Amendment. I refuse to stay quiet while the government chips away at fundamental rights by weaponizing our regulatory authority. This is how I'm using my voice. I encourage you to keep using yours too. So once again, I want to thank you for having me today. I look forward to listening to your ideas about ways in which we can work together to push back against government censorship and control so that this dangerous new normal does not become the status quo.
I am really happy to be here to talk today specifically about freedom of the press. When I got into Hazard yesterday, I started thinking about this man named Ott Stidham. And Ott used to come to my door when I was a kid. He would come and knock on the door, and he was a little rough, a little bit of a rough character. So I would yell to my grandma, "Ott's here," and she would go to the door, and he would unfailingly ask her for a cup of coffee, and she would give it to him, and he would go on about his day. I mentioned him for two reasons. One, that it was here in the mountains that I feel like I learned the dignity of all people. And I think I learned that there was power in journalism and in having a free press to make sure that voices were heard. And as the commissioner just mentioned, even on a local level, what's happening on the federal level is trickling down, and that's really, high stakes for people who are in communities like the one we're sitting in now. So I'll come back to a second reason of mentioning him at the end of this statement. I want to talk about something that piggybacks off of your comments. In the United States now ranks 57th out of 180 countries in the World Press Freedom Index. The group that does that measurement, Reporters Without Borders, says we're now no longer satisfactory, but problematic. And specifically, they said that after a century of gradually expanding press rights, the United States is experiencing its first significant and prolonged decline in modern history. And I don't think that's anywhere we want to be. Thomas Jefferson and our other founders, when they were putting freedom of the press into the Bill of Rights, they believed it was a cornerstone of our democracy. Jefferson said our liberty depends on freedom of the press and that it cannot be limited without being lost. And I think you enumerated, what's at stake and what we lose. Another line that I kept coming back to as I was thinking about this is democracy dies in the darkness, which most of us know the Washington Post adopted in about 2016 as their slogan. But if you look where they really kind of picked, where that bubbled up, there was a federal judge, Damon Keith, who's known for some really significant civil rights decisions. And he said in a 2002 decision, democracy dies behind closed doors. And that was a First Amendment case against the Bush administration. So I think it's important that we think about Judge Keith and other heroes like that, like journalists from the Mountain Eagle here in Letcher County who've been fearless, courageous defenders of the public's right to know, sometimes at great risk and harm. Reporters elsewhere in our state, the Herald Leader, Courier-Journal, they've exposed corruption, covered communities large and small, fought for public record access. These newer nonprofit outlets, the Daily Yonder, the Kentucky Lantern, and our student newspapers, the Kentucky Kernel, they don't hesitate to take on their own university in the name of transparency. And, these are the voices that we need to be supporting. So I'd encourage all of us to be financially supporting our news organizations, be subscribers, be looking for ways that you can support the groups that help them fight their First Amendment rights. And I want to come back to this guy who was knocking on my door as a kid. I thought about him a few months ago and I thought, I want to look him up. Like, who was that? Who was he? And so I looked up in newspapers.com. I thought maybe I'll find his obituary. Well, I didn't find his obituary. Instead, I found a multi-part series of investigative journalism in 1978 by the Louisville Courier-Journal, and it was all about the lack of access to mental health care in Eastern Kentucky, issues in the courts, issues with police, issues with people getting the access to care that they needed. And one of the stories was a spotlight on a case by a woman named they interviewed a woman named Janice Stidham, who was Ott's wife, and she was afraid that he might kill her. And she could not get the access to care that he needed. And the story looked at public records. It looked at, they interviewed public officials. They talked to people who were doing different lawsuits to try to change the system. And so, it just struck me that's why we need a free and vigorous and powerful press. There are voices here like hers, and and the man himself, he needed that help. And that's, we need a free and strong press that's free of government censorship and economically viable so that people's voices are heard. So I'm looking forward to hearing from all of you today.
Freedom of religion, this wall of separation that we speak of is not a constraint really on the practice of one's faith, I think, but offers not only protection from state interference, but also should act as an agent of liberation, giving our faith communities the opportunity to be a voice for justice in the country. The many flavors of our faith in the country are varied and naturally differ from state to state and region to region. For southwestern Virginia and central Appalachia, where I live and serve, the vast majority of Christian folks would consider themselves to be evangelical. Baptist, my handbook of denominations in the United States actually lists 28 different branches of the Baptist faith. Methodist and non-denominational churches dominate the landscape. I serve as an ordained deacon in the Episcopal Church, and the only active deacon in the Abingdon Convocation includes churches from Tazewell County all the way to Big Stone Gap. And in that capacity, I serve as the bishop's deacon on Becoming Beloved Community guiding team. In Wise County, Virginia, the Episcopal Churches operated rideshare that Dee mentioned, which actually originated from efforts at the Apple Shop. And from 2016 to the beginning of the pandemic, we organized 11 rides transporting over 200 people from the Richmond area to the maximum security prisons at Wallens Ridge and Red Onion.
so that they could visit their loved ones who are incarcerated. Through church meals, we fostered relationships with these riders and an awareness of those that were living in our community. In 2018, the Episcopal Church led in the formation of the Community Remembrance Project with Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery, Alabama, and we were able to erect 3 markers recognizing the 3 lynchings in Wise County. And finally, in 2023, St. Thomas Church in Abingdon led a group of churches to sponsor a refugee family from Venezuela. I believe that we are free to practice our brand or flavor of Christianity based on this First Amendment right. It is what our presiding bishop at the time, Michael Curry, called the Jesus movement, an ongoing community of people who center their lives on the teachings of Jesus. I would suggest, probably as Commissioner Gomez tours this country, in the varied regions of our country, she'll find churches and synagogues and mosques and temples filled with folks who engage in practicing their faith without government interference. I don't know right now if we are in a place where the government is actively involved in that interference. And I hope and I pray that that doesn't come to pass, because these places of faith whose shared liberty allows them to work for justice. And that's justice for all folks. Thank you.
I'm talking about the right to assemble. And, all 5 of these rights that you're hearing about are in this First Amendment that's right behind me. The right to peaceful assembly is an indelible part of the United States Constitution in this First Amendment, and being part of the Bill of Rights, which was ratified in December 1791, to add specific guarantees of personal freedoms, which were intended to provide guardrails and limitations to the power of the federal government. And you can probably, most of you can read that, but the part that's pertinent to right to assemble, the Congress shall make no law abridging the right of the people peaceably to assemble. The United States Supreme Court early on in United States versus Cruikshank, 1876, asserted a historical basis for the right of peaceable assembly, saying that it is and always has been one of the attributes of citizenship under a free government. The place of the right to assemble in constitutional law was even more firmly established in 1937 in the case of DeJong versus State of Oregon, when the court held that the 14th Amendment's Due Process Clause applied the First Amendment's right of freedom of assembly to the individual U.S. states. In DeJong, the Supreme Court wrote that the right to peaceable assembly is a right cognate to those of free speech and free press and is equally fundamental, saying the right to assemble is one that cannot be denied without violating those fundamental principles which lie at the base of all civil and political institutions. The Supreme Court reversed DeJong's conviction under an Oregon criminal syndicalism law, ruling that the holding of meetings for peaceable political action cannot be prescribed. The right to assemble is not an absolute right. The courts have been clear that what is protected is peaceable assembly. Protesters cannot abuse the right by using speech or press or assembly in order to incite violence and crime. There must, however, be a clear and present danger or an imminent incitement of lawlessness before government officials are allowed to restrict free assembly rights. In the landmark case of Edwards versus South Carolina in 1963, the Supreme Court reversed the conviction of 187 peaceful segregation protesters for breaching the peace, saying the 14th Amendment does not permit a state to make criminal the peaceful expression of unpopular views. However, government officials may impose some limitations on assembly rights by enacting reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions designed to further legitimate regulatory objectives such as preventing traffic congestion or limiting interference with nearby ongoing activities. On a personal note, in 1987, a group of Eastern Kentuckians led by Dr. Grady Stumbo and myself met in Knott County to start the East Kentucky Leadership Foundation, a completely volunteer nonprofit organization with the purpose of holding an annual conference in Eastern Kentucky when leaders throughout the region could assemble, network, and discuss timely issues affecting the region's economic development and overall quality of life. Over the years, the East Kentucky leadership has tried to hold local governments, the state government, and the federal government accountable when they were ignoring the needs and the basic needs of people in Eastern Kentucky. In April 2025, the EKLF held its 37th annual conference in Manchester, Clay County, Kentucky, with a sold-out crowd and keynote speaker Governor Andy Beshear live and in person. Our yearly assembly, protected by the First Amendment to the Constitution, would not have been tolerated by a despot. As my granddaughter Carly so eloquently wrote, as we look to the future, we should remember that the strength of our democracy is measured not only by the freedoms we proclaim, but by the care with which we preserve them. It is on all of us to cherish this right, defend it fiercely, and use it wisely.
I'm Tiffany Sturdivant, as Dee has introduced me. I'm the executive director of Apple Shop, and I'm going to be talking to you about the freedom of speech, the right to express one's opinions and ideas without government censorship or restraint. The attacks on our freedom of speech, I want to say that it's unprecedented, but I will give just a small caveat to say that it's occurred in our country for many years, right? Maybe not at this like boldness where people are literally losing their jobs or losing their livelihoods, but it has happened in our country. And coming into Apple Shop, I came in here as a community organizer, through Roadside Theater, and there's just something about the methodology of storytelling that has just been built phenomenally. Some of you got the chance to participate earlier today in what we call story circles. The importance of people being able to speak their truth is what is going to really be healing for our country. If we get the opportunity to not just speak, but to hear what people have to say, to understand that we are all as human beings in this country together to work towards a common goal, right? Of making our communities better and helping younger generations to understand what it is that we have been fighting for in this country, and to not lose hold of that, and to understand that it's up to us, as your granddaughter said. It's up to us to protect those freedoms. So I want us to really, really be brave, right? Freedom of speech is to me, it's about telling the truth and not being afraid of that. One of my favorite singers, Nina Simone, she's two quotes that she says that I hold dear to me. And it's that as an artist, it's an artist's role to reflect the times, right? We've seen this happen in the civil rights movement and in different labor movements throughout East Kentucky, where songwriters have really just captured all of the things that sometimes our history books don't tell us. So I would encourage that. And then also, one of my favorite quotes, and I'll end with that, is, I'll tell you what freedom is. It's no fear. So hold on to that. Be brave, be fierce, and yeah, thank you.
I think if we're all being honest here, if we would have had to sat down and as a group name out the 5 rights under the First Amendment, I think we would get to speech and religion and assembly and the press before you would get to the right of the people to petition the government for a redress of grievances. But I would posit that that right is so fundamental that I think we all take for granted that we just have it. So what is it? Well, it's a really old concept. It goes all the way back to the Magna Carta, when the king was literally responding to the wealthy barons' grievances. And so is it petitions, like you might petition that the parking lot in the town square not be expanded, or petition that somebody gets removed from the PTA? Well, yeah, it can be. I think the most famous example of that type of petition is the Declaration of Independence. And it literally talks about petitioning for redress. And so what do those look like? What can they be? The women's suffrage movement, filled with petitions. Leading up to the Civil War around slavery, petitions about that injustice. And who do these petitions go to? Well, they can go to the executive, they can go to the president, they can go to Congress. Now, unfortunately, within this right, you have the right to petition. You don't have the right, at least for the president and Congress, to respond to your petition. You can lobby them. That doesn't mean they have to agree or even respond to what you're lobbying. However, there's a third branch, and I guess as a lawyer, it's kind of where I come in. And it also is expanded to the courts. The idea that you can go to court for redress of grievances, for illegal firings. And, you know, we saw that happen in the civil rights movement. You know, change through the courts, addressing rights that people believe they have, and a court saying, yes, you have that. And that can mean any level of grievance, any level of, you know, wrong, you know, from something that others might think is trivial to something so important, like being unfairly imprisoned. Your right to not be, you know, held in prison without charge. And that right is critical to democracy, to a functioning democracy. It's the alternative to clubs or to swords or to guns. Now, what I will say is, even though that right is so fundamental, that doesn't mean it has to continue forever. Because the courts that can determine what's right and wrong, they don't have guns, they don't have armies, they don't have the physical power to enforce. And I think that's left up to all of us to constantly demand and reinforce this right, that we can, in a civil society, go to bodies and get wrongs addressed. Because otherwise you're you're existing at the end of a barrel. And I think what makes America great is that whether, a miner with black lung or any other person, whether it be individual, whether you have a grievance against an individual, whether it be against a corporation, or most importantly, against the government, has the ability to go in and have that addressed. Thanks.
Thank you so much. This went so quickly. I can't get over that we're wrapping up, huh? I could go on forever. No, it really is a privilege to be here. And I was sitting here listening to all these speakers who have so eloquently described why we have a First Amendment and all of the freedoms within the First Amendment. And I'm very focused, obviously, on freedom of the press and freedom of speech because I'm at the Federal Communications Commission. But the other freedoms are also very important. They're all intertwined in a certain way. Maybe not freedom of religion, but close enough. And hearing all of your experiences, I have truly, truly enjoyed this visit. I am so grateful for the Center of Rural Strategies for putting this together, for the story circle this morning, because it's been so just affirming for me to hear from all of you. One of the things that really I come away from this is the importance of journalism. Talking about shining a light on matters that matter to community, talking about the separation of powers and how important it is that we have a check and balance, also relies on the Fourth Estate. And that is why, to me, the freedom of the press is so precious, because we need that organization to hold us to account and to report and to tell the truth and to tell the facts. And Tracy ended with a plea to please support your journalists, support your journalistic organizations, because we talked about the fracturing of the news. And we need to continue to have in-depth reporting that shows us things like the lack of mental health care in a particular community and what the real results of that are to one particular person and why it matters to everyone. We need that in every possible aspect of our lives. We need that for civic engagement. We need that so that people come to these types of events and know that they're happening, and know what happened at them if they themselves can't take the time off to come see it. So the importance of journalism is paramount. A lot of people that I speak to tell me they're tired. It's a little too soon to be tired. Yeah. We need to take care of our precious liberties. And the way that we do that is by being aware and by speaking up and pushing back. So that is incredibly important. And so I am, again, so incredibly grateful to be here, and to have seen all of you, and to hear from you. And I look forward to continuing to have these discussions as I move forward, as long as I'm around. And even if I get fired, by the way, I plan to continue this tour. A lot of the organizations that have invited me to come visit have said, come one way or another. And so I will continue to do so. So thank you.